Hey, welcome back to Verbose DevOps. Today's video is going to be a comparison between a cloud engineer and also what is a DevOps engineer. I'm going to tell you today. So let's get straight into this. The minimum definition of a cloud engineer is someone who builds and maintains infrastructure in the cloud. So creating infrastructure only in the cloud. Maybe you might also do on-prem stuff in a company data center, or perhaps you've got another team who does that, but in general it's going to be cloud infrastructure. So it could be, for example, your company's on a cloud journey and they're doing a big migration from on-prem to cloud, setting up a cloud center of excellence. This is quite common, especially in the last few years. And a DevOps engineer is different. Similarly, also building and maintaining infrastructure, but in this case it's focused infrastructure, focused on app deployment. So you may also be in charge of other infrastructure as well, or you may have a different team, but as a DevOps engineer you will definitely be focused on the infrastructure that supports application deployment. And I also said here, this is what the developers either cannot or will not do. So in a really small company, in a startup, it may be that they only have developers and no DevOps engineer yet, and they do everything. But over time, typically most companies, the developers will focus on what they do best, which is software engineering. And then they will have their first, their second, and eventually a team of DevOps engineers who will focus on the infrastructure to help deploy those apps, so that developers don't have to do that anymore. That's pretty much it. So apart from these basics, the roles can actually be quite different in themselves, and you can do a whole variety of different things, but these are the core tenets for both of these jobs. Now, what about the scope? Give you a better idea. So a cloud engineer will be concerned with site reliability, so making sure that the infrastructure stays alive, but also maintenance and improvements that are necessary, technological improvements, those kinds of things. And what they'll typically do is build solutions to problems. And they may also architect them as well. So architecture, if you don't know, is everything from starting with discovery, figuring out actually what the problem really is, the business logic maybe that is trying to be fixed or achieved, going through some of the key decisions that have to be made, analyzing the trade-offs, and ending up with a build plan. So if you're an engineer who builds, maybe you get given a build plan every time, but if you don't have that build plan, you need to know what those steps are that you're going to build. Everything before that is the architecture process. So they build solutions to problems. Now, a DevOps engineer is also concerned with site reliability, although that will probably be focused on the application infrastructure, as I mentioned already. But something very different is that they help to enable developers. They are much, much more developer and development centric. So typically the company will have an application. This is what they're selling or providing as a service or as a product to external customers. That doesn't happen if you're a cloud engineer necessarily. If you're a cloud engineer, you may not have any developers even in your company. You may not do any development. We'll come back to that shortly. So you will enable developers. There will also be a focus in general to automate everything. This is very, very much part of being a DevOps engineer. Try and automate everything, get things running more efficiently. As a cloud engineer, you may not have any demands or any pressure to automate everything. It may be something that you do anyway in your spare time and people are happy with it, but there probably won't be a big focus on it. Now, the customer, this will help you better understand. As a cloud engineer, your customer is the company. I'll come back to client later, but typically it will be your company. And as I mentioned, you will build and architect solutions to problems, but you may be asking, well, where are the devs? Well, first of all, you may not have any developers in your company. Your company, you could be a manufacturing company, for example, and you don't develop any software, not even in-house. You just buy software as you need it. But if you do have some developers in your company, then a cloud engineer, you may build and architect solutions to the problems that developers have, but typically you won't get too much into the weeds with them. You will stay out of their way, and hopefully they can self-manage what are probably not that complex in terms of applications, so there just won't be as great a need. Your company may not even have any DevOps engineering separate to what you do as a cloud engineer. So we'll get onto that as well when we look at the infra, but it will tend to be less complex solutions. Now, as a DevOps engineer, it's very different. Really, developers are your customer, and if you treat them as the customer, your company will support that too. It's not like you have different goals, but your developers will be the focus. The goal is for faster and better software development lifecycle, and to achieve that, you will generally help developers to better deploy themselves and also self-serve. Maybe their infrastructure, or they need new pipelines or something. If you can make it so that they can better self-serve in the end, that is the ideal goal. And that leads us to something, it's a relatively new phenomenon called platform management, and that's all about better self-serve for developers. And it's actually a silo in itself, and there's a new phrase now that silos are not bad. So to separate out that you let developers focus on software engineering and that you focus on providing a platform with them as a customer, you're doing two very different things, but there is a customer-provider relationship there. That's not a bad thing. The original DevOps mentality was that it's a culture where everyone is super integrated, there is no separation or less separation of duties, you are one big happy family. That's kind of maturing and evolving, and people are realizing that's a bit of a unicorn that really can't be achieved as a culture or a philosophy. The better way that you can get to it is platform management. But in general, with DevOps, you have a closer relationship to developers, and you may even embed with them to better understand their needs. So this is the case whether it's early days of DevOps or even platform management today. So you can see that's quite different to cloud engineering, where you might not even have developers, and even if you do, you're not going to really set out to integrate very much with them and really serve them in the way that DevOps engineers would. And probably in such a company, there's going to be less of a need, because they're not going to have either zero or not many lower complexity internal applications that are being developed there. So in terms of infra bias, for a cloud engineer, typically you're going to have a heavy emphasis on IaaS, which is really things like virtual machines, and you may even use a lot of managed platform as a service as well. So, but in general, it will tend to be more VM heavy, more traditional. And as a DevOps engineer, you're more likely to see a focus on containers, so Kubernetes, or even other variants like HashiCorp, Nomad, or other Kubernetes distributions, or managed Kubernetes like in the cloud, EKS, GKE, AKS, that type of thing, or even containers as a service. Now, as a DevOps engineer, you may actually have no exposure to containers. That is quite possible. There are plenty of legitimate DevOps shops, let's call them, where you don't use any containers whatsoever. And you can still do all of this. You can still improve the SDLC, help devs better deploy, and self-serve. But, however, containers lend themselves more to DevOps, more to microservices. All of those things you will tend to see together. So my advice is, this is an increasing trend towards containers, whether for right or wrong reasons, it could be argued. However, it definitely is an increasing trend, and you definitely want to get exposure to containers if you don't have it already. So I strongly advise that you pursue that if you are committed to a career as a DevOps engineer. So what about tasks? Well, you know, as a cloud engineer, you should really be doing infrastructure as code. Some companies are still doing point and click with the UI, but they really, really shouldn't be doing that. However, it is possible that you will still do some manual ops, and I don't necessarily mean point and click, but I mean stuff that is just repeatable and kind of boring sequence of tasks that you're doing, and that which is old school type ops. It's still possible that you do that as a cloud engineer, especially if you're in what some people call cloud operations. Okay. Now in DevOps, the aim is to automate everything. You really should not be doing much in the way of operational work. If you're doing anything that's repeatable and is so frequent that it's worth automating, then you should definitely automate it. There's a much bigger focus on automating everything so that you can focus on higher value tasks, especially because it tends to be also a role. A DevOps engineer pays better than a cloud engineer, so you're costing the company per hour what they're paying you. It doesn't make sense for you to do operational tasks. They expect you to automate everything. It's different as a cloud engineer. If you're lower paid, company doesn't mind so much if you're doing operational tasks that could be automated. They're not necessarily that bothered, really. In terms of skills, you were talking here, you shouldn't be point and clicking. It should be infrastructure as code. So Terraform is absolutely the main infrastructure as code tool, and also some operating system, which will typically be Linux. Now, you don't need that much knowledge. You can get away with pretty minimal knowledge as a cloud engineer. Oh, by the way, I just remembered up here where I said the customer can be a client. So if you're doing professional services or even managed services, then it will be, your customer will be multiple companies, which you will call a client. But anyway, skills, Terraform and Linux are pretty minimal skills, to be honest with you. DevOps engineer is a world of difference. It's Terraform as well. It's Linux, but it has to be more advanced because you may be doing more, let's say, performance tuning, but also if you're working with containers, ultimately they run on typically Linux, and you do need to know more advanced what's going on under the hood with Linux. Bash, which is scripting, so there's automation again. You'll be expected to know Bash, and not only Bash, but also Python. You'd definitely be expected to know Python. And something I'm trying to improve myself is not just know Python as good as you need to get the job done and look things up as you need it, but really you need to be like kind of programmer level Python. Start with an IDE and know reference materials and get somewhere. And increasingly more and more, but I call this optional because I really think it's not a good thing to expect people to have, and I don't see all companies asking for this, but increasingly a back-end language. So some companies will say, right, you need to be a Java developer. I think that's unrealistic. I think Java developers would rather do software engineering, focus on being developers, and don't want to do DevOps. Some try, some just lose it, they find the stress too much, and they go back to being a regular developer. So I think, although this is a trend in some respects, I think this will diminish. So I'm calling this optional. It's definitely not essential. So I hope that gives you an idea of the key differences between a cloud and a DevOps engineer. You can definitely start by being a cloud engineer and then progress to being a DevOps engineer. That's definitely a legitimate path. And also what I would say is if it's also a great path if you're a former, let's say, a sysadmin, or not even a sysadmin, maybe a fresh grad with no experience. You can't just go straight to being a DevOps engineer. Even if you have a software engineering degree, you really cannot go and just straight away be a DevOps engineer. I would say focus first on being a cloud engineer. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Look, please support the channel. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, check out the other videos. At the moment, we're pretty small, only a few subscribers and videos, but I'm growing all the time. And the videos, I'm pumping them out. I'm hoping that you're really enjoying them. So hang around, check it out, and I will see you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.